You built without a timer, without applause, without a deadline. There were just stacks of wood, laughter in the distance, and a silence that surrounded you even inside your home. The world thought it was madness. The neighbors mocked. Your children watched you in silence, and even the woman you shared a roof with began to wonder if it was all faith or obsession. Decade after decade, hammer after hammer, you persisted, not out of pride, but because you believed, and it hurt. Because the faith that drove you had no deadline, no relief, no sign. It was just an ancient word, echoing too loudly to ignore. No one understood, but you carried on, convinced that what seemed excessive was perhaps just obedience. You built without a timer, without applause, without a deadline. There were just stacks of wood, laughter in the distance, and a silence that surrounded you even inside your home. The world thought it was madness. The neighbors mocked. Your children watched you in silence, and even the woman you shared a roof with began to wonder if it was all faith or obsession. Decade after decade, hammer after hammer, you persisted, not out of pride, but because you believed, and it hurt. Because the faith that drove you had no deadline, no relief, no sign. It was just an ancient word, echoing too loudly to ignore. No one understood, but you carried on, convinced that what seemed excessive was perhaps just obedience. You woke early, before the village noises, before the mockery began again. The wood, still damp from the dew, was the first touch of the day, as if each plank reminded you that the promise hadn't yet been fulfilled, but hadn't been forgotten either. And then came the sound, saw, hammer, breathing. It was always like that, repetitive, lonely, without anyone's amen, not even hers, because faith, when not shared, weighs twice as much. And although she hadn't gone away, something inside her had already departed. In the beginning there was pride, then respect, now silence. And the silence of someone who loves but no longer believes is an absence that lives within the gaze. Even so, you continued, because each blow against the wood was a response to a voice no one else heard. And even if she didn't understand, even if her children didn't see the meaning, you knew. If the promise was said once, it didn't need to be repeated. Noah was not a priest. He was not a prophet in the temple. He was not a warrior with a sword. He was an ordinary man with an uncommon calling. He did not hide from the earth. He hid from decay. He did not live in haste. He lived with purpose. And while the world raced toward its own desires, he walked against time, as if fighting an invisible thing screaming within. It wasn't the rain that convinced him to build. It was the sound of the voice before the rain. And perhaps that's what sets him apart from all the others. He didn't need to see to act. He just needed to remember what he heard. But that comes at a price. The neighborhood began to drift apart. No one wanted to live near the shipyard madman. The children began to be ridiculed. His wife began to hear whispers at the market. And even when he returned home with splinters in his fingers and calluses on his hands, it wasn't his body that ached. It was her gaze, growing more and more distant, not out of malice, but out of fear. Because waiting together requires more than love. It requires believing what the other person heard, and she didn't hear, only he did. So dinner was eaten in silence, conversations diminished, laughter ceased, and what remained was a routine sustained not by affection, but by resistance. And yet it continued. The world grew old around the unfinished ark. Children were born, trees grew, storms came and went, but none of them were a storm. And he continued, like someone who knows no other way to live, not out of stubbornness, but out of fidelity. Because when God speaks even just once, the echo of that voice can sustain decades of silence. But men don't understand this. Women don't understand. Children don't always understand. And sometimes not even our souls understand, but our spirits understand. And that's why he didn't stop. She no longer argued. She just watched, sometimes with sadness, sometimes with pity, but almost never with hope. Because there was something harder than not believing in God. It was trying to love someone who believed so much. They seemed to have forgotten the world around them. Noah wasn't rude, he wasn't absent, but his soul was occupied with something else, and this occupation took him away from everything daily. He forgot birthdays, let the wood get wet, and spent days without saying anything other than cutting instructions or plank measurements. Because the ark was more than a blueprint, it was an altar under construction, and no one understood that, not even her. The conversations that still took place were short and mechanical. "I've already eaten. We're missing nails." The wind was a problem today, but behind each sentence lay a universe of loneliness, and she felt it too. Only her silence was different. It was the silence of someone waiting for a husband and finding a visionary. The kind of man who no longer belonged to earth, but also didn't live in heaven. He was trapped between the now and what had yet to come. People began to laugh more openly. Some knocked on the wood just to provoke. Others passed by with scornful looks, commenting loudly, "There goes the old carpenter saving the world with a boat in the dust." But Noah didn't respond. He just continued. There were days when Noah himself wondered if it all still made sense. When the wood cracked, when the measurements didn't add up, when he woke up and the sky seemed to mock him with its endless blue. At those times, he said nothing, not to her, not to himself. He just gritted his teeth, took a deep breath, and got back to work. Because stopping meant admitting that maybe the world was right, and deep down, she knew it too. She knew the man she loved was slowly fading away, and even as she tried to respect, even as she tried to support, she was also becoming emptied. Faith tires those who carry it, but it also tires those who watch. At night, she saw him return covered in dust, wearing the same clothes, the same look. He ate slowly, he slept quickly, and dreamed of wood. She, on the other hand, slept late. She was silent. Sometimes she cried, not out of pain, but out of longing for a life where there was more than expected. And yet, something in her resisted. Maybe it wasn't faith, maybe it was love, or compassion, or a thread of hope that still had no name. But it was enough to put bread on the table every morning. It was enough to sew his clothes without complaint. It was enough to keep her from leaving, and maybe that thread was all that held them together. How many times have you loved someone who was building something invisible? Have you ever held the hand of someone who believed in something you couldn't see? If this has been your reality, share it in the comments. Some people need to know they're not waiting alone. Time passed. So much so that no one knew for sure how many years that boat had occupied the center of the field and the center of life. The children grew up listening to jokes. The woman grew old, carrying doubts. And Noah, he simply grew quieter. It wasn't anger nor frustration, it was focus. Because the longer he waited, the more he realized there was only one way to finish, one nail at a time. And that was his prayer, the obedient repetition of an act no one considered sacred anymore. Some friends tried to convince him to stop. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe it wasn't literal. God wouldn't demand so much. But Noah didn't argue. He just listened, took a deep breath, and got back to work. Because he knew those who haven't heard the voice will never understand the silence. And it was this silence that now accompanied him everywhere. God said nothing more. The instruction had been clear at the beginning. After that, no updates, no revisions, no course corrections. It was as if the heavens were testing whether obedience would survive the echo. And Noah chose to continue even without knowing if he was still right. His faith didn't depend on applause, nor on proof. It depended on memory, and that memory was stronger than the village's scorn. Even so, he was bleeding inside. Some days, Noah watched his wife from a distance. She laughed with the other women, but her joy seemed rehearsed. She harvested, planted, cared for her grandchildren, but she never spoke of the ark, and neither did he. It was the subject that lived between them like an uncomfortable secret, like something that could not be touched without hurting. One day she entered the construction site. She remained silent. She looked at the size of the boards, the height of the walls. Then, without saying anything, she left. He didn't ask anything, because they both knew there was nothing more to explain. He had no answers, only hammers, and she didn't want theories, only peace. But peace was all that was missing, because peace is not the absence of conflict. It is certainty within doubt. And in that house, there was no longer any certainty. Only silence, repetitions, and a hope that faded with time. Still Noah believed, because though no one saw, he felt it. He felt something in the wood, in the smell of the resin, in the sound of the hammering. He felt as if every part of the building were an extension of the promise, as if, by obeying with his hands, he sustained the faith that no longer found words. Sometimes all that's left is to keep going, because stopping would destroy you more than exhaustion. If you've ever been through a season where no one saw any meaning in what you were doing, not even those who walked beside you, write in the comments what it was like to carry on. Only God knows the reason. The day the ark was completed, there were no trumpets. There was no music, no celebration, just a different kind of silence. The kind of silence that precedes something great or terrible. Noah stood before that gigantic structure, his hands covered in dust and his soul weighed down by decades. He didn't cry, he didn't smile, he just breathed. For the first time in a long time, he felt there was nothing more to add. The work was finished, but his heart, it was at war, because the world was still dry. The promise hadn't yet been moved. The sky remained clear. The people continued to laugh. And the ark sat there, immense, empty, looking more like a sculpture of madness than a divine refuge. But Noah knew, when God commands construction, it's because he's already moving time, even if the heavens still seem motionless. She watched the ark from afar. She said nothing, but her eyes were different. Less irony, less weariness, perhaps a trace of respect, because after all, he was finished. Years of silent contempt were replaced by a shy reverence. Maybe she didn't believe in the flood, but she believed he did, and that, in a way, was faith too. The children drew closer. They no longer mocked, they no longer questioned. There was something about that structure that intimidated them. Maybe it was the size, maybe it was the detail, maybe it was the constancy of a father who never gave up. And in that moment, without even realizing it, they began to enter into the realm they didn't understand, simply because one man didn't back down. And then the sound changed. It came first in the animals, an inexplicable movement. They began to arrive one by one, two by two, from every corner. No human command, no net, no shout. They just came, as if they knew where to go, as if guided by the same sound that moved Noah so many years ago. People began to stop, to watch. Some fled in fright. Others tried to find explanations, but there was no logic. There was no control, only the evidence that something was about to break. And Noah just watched, not with vanity, but with fear, because now it was no longer he who built, it was God who moved. His wife, seeing the animals entering, approached. She touched the wood, she touched his shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, she cried, not out of fear, but out of surrender. Because now it was no longer about him being right or wrong. It was about the presence of a God who never needed approval to begin acting. The ark was no longer madness. It was a door between what would be preserved and what would be undone. Have you ever experienced a moment when everything changed and those who doubted you had to acknowledge what you'd built in silence? If so, tell us in the comments what it was like to see God start something after so long, when you were the only one who believed. The entrance was slow, unhurried, unspectacular. The animals were already inside. The children were apprehensive. His wife was silent. And Noah, with his hands on the ark's doorframe, hesitated for a moment, not out of doubt but out of reverence, because walking through that door was more than seeking shelter. It was accepting that what was to come was no longer up to him. When he stepped inside the ark for the last time, something changed. It was as if the world outside had gone silent. The village could no longer be heard. The horizon could no longer be seen. Only the sound of wood and the smell of animals. And then came the final gesture. God closed the door from the outside, without warning, without a word, without fanfare, just the dry sound of a boundary being drawn between what would be saved and what would be left. Inside, no one said anything. Everyone was expecting something, thunder, a gale, a tremor, but nothing came. Not on the first day, not on the second, not on the third. The ark floated in uncertainty. Darkness reigned, humidity rose, and the sky silent. Noah sat near the side. He placed his hand on the wood as if asking, but no answer came, no vision, no dream, no solace. Only the echo of the instruction he had received before all this began. It was this word, ancient, unique, solitary, that now sustained a multitude trapped in a wooden box, waiting for something no one knew what it would be like. Outside, the waters began to rise, slowly, then with force. People tried to take cover. They tried to run. They banged on the ark. They screamed, but the door wouldn't open. Because the door wasn't his, it was God's, and when God closes, and it's not out of cruelty, it's on purpose. Inside, the noise was different. Restless animals, children crying, wood creaking, and a divine silence that weighed more heavily than any sound. Because God didn't explain. He just sealed it, and this absence of words was the greatest proof that he was there, not making noise, but sustaining everything. Noah's wife, now on the other side of faith, no longer mocked, no longer questioned. She prayed. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, she prayed as one who didn't need to understand, just to be sustained. And that was faith too. Noah, for his part, didn't move much. He walked little. He spoke even less, not out of fear, but out of humility, because now he knew his part was over and the rest belonged to heaven. And if today you find yourself in a place where everything seems closed, where nothing depends on you anymore, where the only thing left is to trust, perhaps God has already sealed the door, not to punish you, but to preserve you. Have you ever experienced that kind of silence where all you can do is remember the last thing God said to you? Share in the comments what it was like to walk through the darkness, trusting only in the memory of the promise. Time passed, but no one knew how much. Days and nights lost count inside the ark. The sounds of rain gave way to absolute silence, and little by little, what was once tumult became routine. Caring for the animals, collecting water, waiting, praying without knowing if one could still be heard, sleeping with the sound of constant rocking. Life became waiting, and waiting became faith, until one day, a different sound. First a crow, then a dove, then a leaf, a leaf. It wasn't a miracle in the eyes of the world, but for someone who had seen only wood and water for months, a leaf was redemption. It was the sign that life still existed beyond the high windows. It was confirmation that what God promised hadn't sunk. Noah didn't jump. He didn't scream. He just took a deep breath. Because now he understood, God didn't need to scream to confirm a promise. He just needed to keep what he had said, and that's what he did. Then finally, the voice, not the woman's, not the children's, not the animals', but God's. After everything, after the silence, after the ark, after the fear, an instruction, simple, clear, and profound, come out of the ark. And Noah understood that leaving was as sacred as entering. He descended, his feet stomped firmly. The ground was not the same. The earth had changed. The world had changed, and so had he. The man who entered bearing obedience left bearing history. The silence had not been punishment. It had been preparation. And before planting, before harvesting, before starting anything over, he built an altar. Because true deliverance doesn't end with plans, it ends with worship. And that altar wasn't just thanksgiving, it was remembrance. It was the recognition that if they were there, it was because God sustained them in the darkness, in the silence, in the ark without direction, in the promise without confirmation. The wife approached. She touched the altar. She touched him, and she wept again. Because now there was no longer any doubt. It was surrender. She didn't understand everything, but she knew God had spoken and answered. With water, with silence, with leaves, with direction. Everything had been an answer. Have you ever left a station of waiting and stepped onto a new beginning? Have you realized after a long time that God never abandoned you? He just kept you locked away until the right time? If this has happened to you, write in the comments about the first time you saw dry land after your ark. Noah stepped down from the ark, stepped onto solid ground, built an altar, and planted. Life had to go on. The earth cried out for roots. And the soul, after so much confinement, needed to breathe freedom. But not all freedom is easy, because sometimes, after surviving judgment, it's the weariness of rebuilding that brings us down. That's how it was with him. The man who had floated above the chaos now stumbled upon his own humanity. He drank, he lay down, he was exposed, vulnerable. Not before an unbelieving people, but before his own family. And this moment, as human as it was tragic, revealed something that not even the flood showed, that even the obedient fail, even the chosen crumble, even those who listen to God are still flesh. But God did not reject him, nor did he cancel the covenant, nor did he demand perfection as a condition for permanence. The rainbow, silent and eternal, still rested in the sky. Because God's faithfulness does not depend on the stability of man, it is born of promises he himself wrote. And these promises do not evaporate with falls. They endure, because they are sustained by one who does not change. His wife found him there, lying vulnerable, unconscious from drink and exhaustion. She didn't scream. She didn't run away. She didn't despise him. She simply covered him. And in that gesture, without words, she revealed that she understood. She understood that the man who built the ark, who endured silence, who carried generations on his shoulders, also needed to be reminded that he was still loved, not because of his strength, but despite his weakness. The sons saw. One scoffed, two respected, and that sealed their fates, because how you treat the fragility of the one who sheltered you says a lot about who you are when everything falls apart. Noah would rise later, silent, ashamed, but not forgotten. Because the covenant God made with him was greater than the mistake he made. And perhaps that's the point. True faith doesn't end with obedience. It continues after the fall, after the altar, after the exposure. Because God isn't impressed by those who never stumble. He walks with those who get up still staggering. He strengthens the steps of those who confess. He sustains those who don't give up even after disappointment. The silence that once seemed like punishment now sounded like an eternal whisper. I'm still here. God didn't shout. He didn't punish. He simply remained. And this permanence is what transforms shame into testimony, weakness into an altar, and stumbles into renewal. If you've ever fallen after a period of obedience, if you've ever felt unworthy even after doing everything right for so long, if you've ever had to rebuild what you broke with your own hands, share in the comments, what altar did you need to build even after your failure? The ark stopped, the door opened, the altar was raised, the wine was tasted, and life went on. But nothing was the same. Because after you've been silent for too long, even the sound of your own breathing sounds different. And Noah breathed with memory. He remembered the sound of the axe on the trunks, the laughter of the people, the look in his wife's eyes. The time he spent building without knowing when he would finish. He remembered the silent sky, the weight of the wood, the first drop, the closing of the door, the confinement, the smell of the ark, the silence that swallowed the days, the leaf in the dove's beak, the instruction that freed him, the altar that ignited the new world, the shame that came after, the covenant that remained even then. And in the midst of it all, one phrase whispered inside like an invisible refrain, your last response, not a new answer, not an unprecedented prophecy, but the understanding that perhaps God doesn't speak because he has already spoken, and what he has said is enough to sustain us until the end. Noah understood that a promise doesn't need applause. It needs permanence. That faith isn't made only of miracles, but of memory. That obedience isn't a test of strength, but a sign of listening. That silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's continuity. God doesn't need to repeat what he's already promised. He just needs you to remember. And when the bow formed in the sky, it didn't shine to impress. It shone to seal. It was the signing of a pact that would survive generations, empires, falls, and rebuildings. And Noah, even tired, even scarred, even human, knew what he heard at the beginning still held true, even after everything. Your last response may have been silence, an absence, a closed door, a time too long, an altar erected amidst doubt, a leaf in the water, a stumble after the crossing. But if God is still with you, then the answer is still alive. Because God doesn't just answer with words, he answers with permanence. And what he started with you, he will finish. Even if he doesn't say anything else, even if everything seems to stand still, even if you've already fallen, he continues. And when you realize you survived, that you left the ark, that you're still breathing, that you still believe, you'll understand. Silence was what made you hear better. Absence was what made you remember what he said. Weakness was what made you rest in grace. And the promise still stands. That was your last answer. And it still resonates, even when there is no sound.